Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Hi. Thank you for coming out on a rainy and gray Sunday to have a chance to think together and I'll give you the kind of apologia that many of us have been giving, which is I'm not a Yoko Ono scholar, and Karen Shimakawa described herself yesterday as a fangirl, and I was like, I'm going to lift that from Karen Shimakawa. I'm also a fangirl, but as I've been sort of preparing this talk and reading over her work and going over it, it sort of really came to me how deep and fundamental my relationship to Yoko, like totally personal and not professionalized in any way, but it really came to me how utterly formative her art practice and her presence in the world as an intellectual and as an artist and as a creative and as a political provocateur has been. And I was telling Jen, who's in the room today, and then I was telling my mom, like, I'm going to be at this Yoko Ono symposium, and she was like, just so you know, and my mom is like a hippie, right? And I'm a child of the 60s, and my mom was like, oh my God, like, that reminds me, I took you to see Yoko when you were a baby. And I was like, really? And she was like, yeah, I took you to the concert at Varsity Stadium in Toronto when you were like 5 months old. And I'm thinking, like, really? I was 5 months old and you took me to a Doors concert, which is like basically what, and she was like, yeah. And so there you were, and you're like 20 feet from the front of the stage on a blanket, and you're 6 months old, and that's how you first saw Yoko. And then she was like, well, actually, first you heard Yoko, and then she came out of the bag. So that's like, I've really just been thinking with how much her practice has informed even who I am as a scholar, and maybe you'll get a bit of a sense of that. I hope you get a bit of a sense of that. I do want to thank Tavia for inviting me. This talk is a bit of a mishmash. I just finished a book called Deviant Matter that I'll talk about a little bit, and in it I'm looking at these various deviant materialities: fermentation, intoxication, rot, and gelatinousness. And this is from my chapter on gelatinousness, which I had meant to talk about Yoko, and then it fell out in the book. And so I'm looking forward to developing it and just kind of inviting you into the film. I hope you've all had a chance to see it. But in order to get to Yoko, I'm going to kind of take us through a bunch of other work first. So starting with an artist, Dirty Surface. So Dirty Surface is, and these are my books. I write about food and race and sexuality, and you don't have to buy them. I put them up there. It's shameless promotion, but buy them or don't buy them. Okay, that's me. So David Finlay to start, or the artist Dirty Surface that I want to talk about first, is a Canadian filmmaker, activist, and artist, as well as a teacher of, we had to call him a porn pedagogist. He's someone who teaches people how to make their own pornography. In a project completed in 2008, Dirty Surface made a computer screensaver that he called the Generous Gesture Butt Massage Video Wallpaper. As Dirty Surface tells it, the project began with one simple question: what would pornography look like without capitalism? I'm going to run it in the background. So the wallpaper is just under 60 minutes long, and during the 60 minutes, 10 bodies appear on the screen. They're cut off at around the shoulder or the shoulder blades, or at the waist rather, and then just below the butt. And as the video begins, some of them are clothed in underwear, some of them are already naked. And lying on what appears to be black velvet, the bodies are splattered with and adorned with oil with coconut oil, he told me. And as they're massaged, they become shinier and shinier over the 60 minutes. Fair warning, this gets fairly explicit. So the bodies are various shades of white and various shades of brown and black. Those are David's hands servicing them. And across the space of the film, or of the video rather, some of the bodies are penetrated, some are just massaged, some are fucked with toys or fists or fingers, others are spanked with hands or whipped with clothing and with belts, and still others are stroked and prodded and pulled to reveal the vaginas and the anuses beneath. As the erotic intensity of the video climbs, the overhead light shines and glints off the buttocks and backs, and those buttocks slowly open up and give and receive pleasure. Legs spread, backs arch, bodies push back into the hands that work into the muscles and explore, with no unconsiderable skill, the diffuse nerve endings that circulate in those areas. Bottoms stretch open and they close, they push up, they drop down, they jiggle, they're shaken, they dimple, and they bend. There's no sound. So I talk about generous gesture in my recent book, Deviant Matter, which just came out last November. I'm a scholar predominantly of food, race, and sexuality in the US, with something of a newer focus on the history of science. My first book was called Racial Indigestion, and this is my third book, Deviant Matter. My recent work has engaged a branch of philosophy called the New Materialism, which, via conversation with our present ecological and environmental and political crises, seeks to rethink or undo the human-centeredness of much Western writing and philosophy by poking at some of the most precious distinctions that we live with. For instance, the distinction between subjects or people and objects or things, between animals and humans, or humans and non-human animals. I never get that right. But my particular interest has been in studying how aesthetics, the study and valuation of art, but more specifically the organization of our very senses themselves, are implicated in political order. And in this book, I do it through attention to 4 material categories, including rot, ferment, intoxication, and apropos of this talk, gelatinousness or jelly. This is a little bit in line with, for instance, Sion Nai's project of examining late capitalism's minor aesthetic categories, such as animatedness or the gimmick, and of tracking their resonances across time, of thinking about why and how we feel what we feel as bodies and as subjects and as communities, and how these categories, these feelings, come to congeal as recognizable genres. But my take is somewhat different from Sion's. I'm interested in getting closer to what is not human in the world, and of trying to think nearer or with the sensual qualities of matter. Shall I freeze this? It's like, yeah, it's fine, right? Everybody fine? Nobody's freaking out? You're good with it? Okay, great. I'm in New York. So in undoing our own precious fantasies about being human, of like undoing the value of our human subjectivity as above the animal or as above the passivity of matter, and also undoing the valuing of, for instance, science or the law's aesthetic commitment to rationality, objectivity, and the rendering statistical of life, as above such equally valuable experiences as mess, decomposition, touch, contact. Another word for that might be hygiene, as a kind of violent aesthetic order, or in the language of legal liberal philosophy, the police or police power. So for instance, in the book I chase these deviant materialities to show how they have become figures for both deviant forms of human life and deviant forms of collectivity, but also forms of energy that escape the extractive imperatives of state capitalism. So for instance, in the jelly chapter of Deviant Matter, I think with a subfield of physics to understand this materiality that I call gelatinousness. And here, let me show you some jelly. So rheology is a subset of physics that examines and measures the flow and deformation of matter, specifically focusing on classes of liquids that behave like they're solids and solids that behave like they're liquids. So the science of rheological substances is at least in part the science of those substances whose movement cannot be calculated by the usual work of physics. Rather than simply breaking or giving way when they're dropped or given to pressure, these are materials that actually behave paradoxically. So when they're subjected to stress, they actually get thicker. So for instance, whipped cream, when you whip it, gets thicker and turns into a solid. Or, for instance, they liquefy when you put stress. For instance, ketchup is actually a solid in a bottle, then when you puncture it, it turns into a liquid. And as this video, produced by Nathan Myhrvold's Modernist Cuisine group, shows, some rheological substances, like jelly, deform when they're pressured, and they stretch and they bend and they give, and then they bounce back. So, the measure for understanding how these materials perform in industrial and food sciences is variously defined as shear or stress. Pressure is applied to them and then they bounce back. But because of their unconventional performance of movement or flow and because of their unusual relationship to energy, These very kind of wide group of substances are classed together under non-Newtonian physics. And so what's really kind of interesting about these, and I often think of this as like a former dancer, is what's really interesting in these materials is that they're sort of, they're paradoxical within science, but one of the things they do is that when they're submitted to deformation, so for instance, if any of you ever did kind of Horton or Graham technique, right, they're twisted and they turn, but what they actually do is like they hold on to energy and then they sort of bounce back into shape. And this sort of gives us something to work with in thinking differently about how matter exhibits a kind of creativity or a kind of energy or a kind of like agency in and of itself. And interestingly, two of the main substances in human and animal bodies, fat and blood, are rheological substances. So blood, for instance, can demonstrate variable viscosity, and in human biomechanics, rheology or biorheology is used to measure and understand the overall mechanical behavior of skin, or in particular, fat. So this is not just science, right? So gelatinous is not just a kind of, so gelatinous is kind of like an object of science, but it's not just an object of science, it's object of myth. As for instance, in these pictures from the Jello Museum in Leroy, New York. These detail experiments proving that brains and lime jello, as the cutting claims here, register on an EEG as identical in microvoltage and in amplitude and in frequency. So this actually turns out not to be scientifically true, like we're not identical to Jello and our brains are not made of lime Jello. Thanks for laughing, Jen. However, we are actually really alike. There's a fundamental correspondence between gelatinous material and how like bouncy gelatinous material moves in our body. And this is kind of provocative to think with because of what this says about how at a kind of sensory and our physical level, our own bodies, our own bodily materiality is itself gelatinous. As multiple artists have engaged. And this can be used to kind of experiment with and think about other ways of being human. So as against the individualism of humanness, for instance, these bouncy and gelatinous substances react to external stimuli. They move because they internalize the imagery around them, the energy around them, the force of sound waves, for instance, and then they re-express that energy as recovery or as dance. So here, for instance, here, let me do that with music in a second. In a video collaboration produced by Jenny Summers with Bumpus and Parr, Bumpus and Parr are kind of these famous, actually like jelly artists, and they do like jelly installations in England. 4 different colored jellies made from 2 different mold shapes appear in a 4-paned video screen. And as the music by the group Social Skills runs in the background, the jellies, each in their windows, gyrate and move and jiggle and respond to the music in unique ways. Let me play it for you.
I've been thinking that I'm drifting through my day. Nighttime, I keep drinking, I keep driving you away, 'cause I know no other way. As hard as I try, I just can't let go. I just can't let go. I just can't let go.
I usually try to stop when the white one lifts its legs up. It's kind of cool, isn't it? Yeah. So as against, okay, so yeah, so in this video, like one jelly sways from side to side and it lifts up one prong of its molded shape as though it's like lifting and stamping its foot, and another one bounces just on itself, right? Kind of like a qigong exercise. Sometimes I do that with my students just to get their bodies loose. Another one sort of meditatively points downward until the music escalates and is just wildly swaying from side to side. And another just sways slowly and dolorously, and it bounces up and down with these like little bops. Each jelly, in a sense, has its own character. So I'm gonna keep it going because it's fun to look at, and I'll turn off the sound here. So what Summers' 4 dancing jellies show us is something like a kind of relational but also agential movement. It is sound made visible by these waves colliding, sound waves, right, made material by colliding with other kind of more visible forms of matter. So by engaging this film and these other films, what I'm trying to think about is what is it that jelly itself, what is it that gelatinous objects do that no other kind of matter can do? They render invisible forms of touch visible. And this is something different than thinking with animate materiality, right? These are not objects moving in and of their own will, but in a sense that, like, the political philosopher Jane Bennett means when she thinks of vibrant matter. These are actually materials that are exquisitely relational in their materiality, and they manifest and materialize forms of touch not otherwise visible to the eye, and they manifest that in and as movement. So kind of what's at stake here in my exploration, in my ongoing exploration of the gelatinous, is an engagement with the organization of the senses, both as it relates to what happens when human objects and non-human subjects encounter each other, but also because it's a bioreological matter, like the material of the human body itself, and therefore what it's like for us as humans, what it's like for humans as humans to encounter the materiality of their own bodies and encounter that materiality as our non-human humanness, right? So the kind of humanness of this animate materiality, it's uncannily like, why is it dancing with me, right? But then, like, the weird, like, non-ongoing movement of my own body. So, like, for instance, like how we're all schooled to, like, make sure our body doesn't keep jiggling once we stop moving, right? This is, like, deeply part of, like, what is valued in human, but actually our body keeps jiggling. That's part of the uncanniness of our body. So, like, how can we think with these relational materials together? So thinking with gelatinousness then allows us to appreciate our humanness as it exceeds or it operates outside of our sovereign will and desires for it, outside of the precious individualism that so limits us politically, but also outside of the kind of dialectic or the binarism of subject versus object, and move into perhaps thinking with materiality to something like collective relationality. So coming back to the generous gesture, up here. So what interests me here, and I'll get to Yoko in a second, I totally promise. So what interests me about the generous gesture here is like the haptic and touch-intensive quality of the film, and the way the greased and oiled bodies and hands are both intimately exposed and also anonymous and rendered strange in the fact that they're just backs. So this is a video wallpaper entirely about touch, about the give and take of it, and then in turn, what touch between bodies reveals to us, particularly the texture of flesh and all of its soft, rheological gelatinousness, its squishy, jiggly shape holding, right? So remember, it takes the pressure, but also flexible substantiveness, and its ability, and gelatinousness's ability to return to its original form no matter the pressure that it is subjected to. This is, so the bodies here register and demonstrate exactly the kind of deformative and responsive movement that I've already kind of shown and explained in terms of these other rheological materials. But here we see a much more detailed visualization of the deformative effects of one body's contact with another. But here's a kind of deformation in the service of care and collectivity. So generous gesture, that is a screensaver about sex and community. It's about using kink to work out the kinks left in the body after the stress, pressure, and compression of the social have left their deep and invisible marks. But it's also about the dissolution of individual bodies into a multiplicity, and a dissolution made erotic and made possible that by the depersonalization of those being massaged into mere squishy backsides, bouncy bottoms, and gelatinous bums. So let's take seriously the question, what would pornography look like without capitalism, as a question about filmic form? Without capitalism, we might ask, would there be, as Linda Williams asked, no money shot? Would there be no stars? Can sexuality, can erotics be environmental, atmospheric, diffused, and not simply subject-centered, genital? Generous gesture is, remember, wallpaper. It comes on when you forget to touch your mouse or your keyboard or your computer or your phone. It comes on when you walk away from being plugged in and when you walk away from working. Despite its intense sexuality, generous gesture is meant to be background noise. So in posing and working from the question, what would pornography look like without capitalism, I see Finley's work here as an extension and reworking of Audre Lorde's thinking on the uses of the erotic, enacting and even expanding what I've always understood as her theorizing of erotics as a utopian rethinking of unalienated labor, including the work of making art. Here we go. She wrote, "Another important way in which the erotic connection functions is the open and fearless underlining of my capacity for joy, in the way my body stretches to music and opens in response, hearkening to its deepest rhythms. So every level upon which I sense also opens up to the erotically satisfying experience, whether it's dancing or building a bookcase or writing a poem or examining an idea." For Lord, in these passages, the erotic proposes a unity of sensation and purpose between body and act, between self and labor, between sensation and idea, the full reward of which is returned to the creator as satisfaction. But it's worth recalling that the thought image that Lord works with in this canonical essay is itself the gelatinous. And here I'm going to play it for you because I can't believe I didn't know that you could listen to Audre Lorde read the uses of the erotic. Oh, sound.
Some of you are not, but during World War II, we would buy sealed plastic packets of white, uncolored margarine with a tiny little intense pellet of yellow coloring perched like a topaz just inside the clear skin of the bag. We would leave the margarine out for a while to soften, and then we would pinch the little pellet, breaking it inside the bag, releasing that rich yellowness into the soft, pale mass of the margarine. Then, taking it very carefully in our hands, we would knead it very gently back and forth, over and over, until the color had spread throughout the whole pound of margarine, leaving it thoroughly colored. I find the erotic such a kernel within myself. When released from its intense and constrained pellet, it flows through and colors my life with a kind of energy that heightens and sensitizes and strengthens all my experience.
So note the movement from I to we and back to I and out to we. The massaging and her memory of massaging the pellet, and she's massaging with her sisters and her mother, right? This is like, which we remember from Zami. The finger is a collective one. The fingers are laboring together, massaging, kneading, and releasing that topaz. The action transforming and coloring gelatinous margarine is a shared one that then returns to the I, the kernel within myself, and then expands again, the energy that strengthens all of my experience. So, holding that idea then of the erotic, holding that idea of like the gelatinousness as a sort of medium through which to think through both alternate sensory orders alternative to or ulterior to being human, and also alternate sensory orders ulterior to subjectivity, to individuality, and to and to like the kind of preciousness of liberal humanity. The formal jump then from these gelatinous bodies and then also the generous gesture to Yoko Ono's film number 4, or Bums, should be obvious. So let's just watch a few moments from it. She finally got there.
Shooting began last Saturday on Yoko's latest film, number 4. The filming is being done in a London studio in the greatest secrecy. Miss Ono, the Japanese avant-garde artist, composer, explained that the film would be her first feature-length production, and said that the subject matter would provide a previously overlooked means for expanding consciousness. The footage consists of even 20-second shots of various subjects, celebrities, artists, actors and actresses, pop personalities, and otherwise people from all walks of life.
I don't like the idea of it. I personally don't think I would enjoy watching the film. I don't like the idea of it. I think that it's a statement of the obvious.
Oh yeah, but this is all such a generalization that it becomes grotesque. Everything is worthwhile. Then a person could spend his life doing anything for 24 hours a day and saying that it's worthwhile. Life is short. It's 60 or 70 years, and the way some people do things more worthwhile than other people. And the thing is to edit your time and to edit your life to do the things that are most valuable for you. Not that.
All right, there you go. Now you're angling off to the right again. Okay, good. That's good. Just like that. Very good. Okay, just keep walking like that till you get the hang of it. Do you think you have it right now?
Yeah, just run away. Yeah.
If
Turn
you
down the volume
stand
a
up
bit.
perfectly straight, just stay relaxed. The thing won't run away from you.
So I hope the formal jump then from Generous Gesture to film number 4, Bums, is a little bit obvious. Filmed in 1966 to 1967 in the townhouse of art dealer and poet Victor Musgrave. It's an 80-minute, 16mm black and white film that was an extended version of her earlier film, film number 4, Flux film number 16, that she filmed in 1966 in her Manhattan apartment with a group of friends. Her instructions for the film are clear. Let me turn it down. String bottoms together in the place of signatures for petition of peace. In a later interview, Yoko said, most films, including what I make, you always have a background. And so I wanted to make a film that there's no background. And by doing this, that becomes a form instead of part of the form. And also I like the idea that it has 4 sections, and when it's walking, each 4 sections move in a different way. So that and the fact that there's no background, so it suddenly becomes an entirety. I thought this a way of a protest against all ills, but together, 365 bottoms are going to, together, protest. So some thematic commonalities then with Generous Gesture that I want to point to. In the first case, seriality. Let's come back to it. So in the first case, seriality. In Generous Gesture's case, it's spatial, as the bottoms are spaced out in the windows next to each other. And in number 4's case, a kind of temporal seriality, as each of the 200 bottoms, she had intended for be 365, she only got 200 only, as each of the 200 bottoms appear one after the other. Second, anonymity. Even though at the beginning of the 80-minute film, the credits run and you actually get to see all the names. You're totally like looking for all the celebrities, right? But it's really anonymous. You don't know whose bums are who. You don't know who's speaking. You don't know if the speaking subject is the same as the walking subject. So a kind of anonymity, a de-individuation that rather than taking away from the subject's value, gradually accumulates into a sense of collectivity that's underlined by the aggregated testimony of the voices speaking at the same time as the bums are walking. So this is a democracy of bums and a democracy of opinions, an aimless, what she called an aimless petition signed by people with their anuses, as she wrote, reflecting, as she wanted, the London scene at that moment. That de-individuation across gender and across race is partly, she says, about how the bum is a bum and a bum is not a face, the face, of course, being the seat of the self. And my favorite quote is from a man with a West Indian accent who says, "Your buttocks don't change their expression," which is unlike your face, you see, which changes expression according to your mood. Your buttocks just sort of stay one way. Third, that fundamentally democratic construct of consent. And of course we can and we should problematize that in a million ways, as feminist critics have for many, many years. But as the opening of Generous Gestures shows us, each performer is over the age of consent, 18 at the time of recording, and these legalities have been scrupulously observed and recorded and saved. Also in an interview, Dirty Surface told me that the terms of each massage have been individually negotiated with each performer in a detailed pre-filming interview, which is something that is fundamental to his own artistic practice. Similarly, in number 4, the ongoing interviews in the background of the film allow each performer to explore their own thoughts and feelings about the film, to tell the interviewer what it felt like to have their bottom filmed, and to reflect on the event. Ono called the film a happening as art. I don't see number 4 as sexual in the same sense that Generous Gesture is clearly a direct engagement, as he tells us, with sexually explicit pornography. But pornography nonetheless lingers in the background of the many recorded anonymous interviews as people wonder, is this pornography? Am I acting? Would I do this if it was pornography? Is it different that it's just my bum? And so on and so on, and make jokes like, maybe you should show this in a particular kind of cinema, yuck, yuck, yuck. And of course, as we know, the London Council did its job in the perpetual tango between art and the state and gave the film an R rating, which led to further protests, which led to more publicity, and now it's a big success. Yeah, that's one of my favorites. So fourth, I think the fundamental humor of the work is a poke at the masculinism of art. And as she wrote, and I just want to read this quote, "I wonder why men can get serious at all. They have this delicate long thing hanging outside of their bodies which goes up and down by its own will. If I were a man, I would always be laughing at myself. Humor is probably something the male of the species discovered through their own anatomy. But men are so serious. Why? Why violence? Why hatred? Why war? If people want to make war, they should make a color war, and they should paint each other's cities up during the night in pinks and greens. Men have an unusual talent for making a bore out of everything they touch. Art, painting, sculpture. Like, who wants a cast iron woman, for instance? So here, I just want to kind of zero in and just to start to wrap up on this idea of the masculinist boringness of the cast iron woman, a bit that really takes us back kind of directly to the question of jelly and texture. By the way, and as it turns out, one of Yoko Ono's, I found it this morning, or I would have done something with it, right? But like I found it this morning, one of Yoko Ono's early New York performances in her loft apparently involved taking Jell-O out of her fridge and throwing it at a wall, throwing it at paper on a wall, which was like treated with like flame retardant, and then like setting the thing on fire. So I'm not sure what to do with that yet, but I offer it to you as something to think with. But here, what I want to return to, right, when we're talking about like who wants a cast iron woman and the idea of like the humorousness of the film, and this is what she wrote about her own film, is to return to what Ono says is like the hapticity, right, the collapsing of sight and touch in the close-upness and in the concentration and abstraction of the four of the buttocks. The idea that it has four sections, and when it's walking, each four sections moves in a different way, right? So that and the fact there's no background, it becomes an entirety. So, right, so like kind of like thinking with like, what is it strange and like uncanny about the bounciness and like the particular texture of the gelatinous in the human body that allows us to move to a kind of sense of collectivity and a kind of abstraction and a kind of lack of individuation, and easily lends itself to the imagining of forms of collectivity that are actually like expansive and democratic and collectivizing. None of, I think many of these ideas have been written about in the art criticism. None of these, I think, are particularly original observations. Many art critics have discussed Ono's utopian and democratizing. Let's stay with it, right? More bums. I feel like every bum should have its due. Okay. Utopian and democratizing impulses, including Midori Yoshimoto and Julia Bryan Wilson, who specifically discusses democratization in relation to Ono's ongoing conversation with bums in her great essay on posterity for the MoMA catalog, where she writes, quote, by focusing on rear ends, flies, and farts within the decorous space of the art institution, and by asserting that her actions serve as a calls for peace, Ono links her interest in sexual freedom and in body innocence with larger issues of liberation. Obviously, I'm in full agreement with this, but what I want to open up here is something related and perhaps a bit more specific and different, which is to ask how the specifically gelatinous rheological materiality of bums, the gelatinousness of the human body, which in many ways I think is the kind of real star of film number 4, like, whoa, every bum is weird, right? These 4 bits moving in different directions is pushing us at a sensory and erotic level, erotic in the expansive and atmospheric sense of Lord's work, to undo humanness as a problem by proposing a kind of sensory ecology otherwise to our present, which is, as it turns out, such a total bummer. I'll stop there. So, questions? It's a lot of material to throw at you fast, sorry. Yeah. Talia.
Thank you. I knew that you would deliver, and I apologize for walking in. I think probably more than halfway, but we have this conversation, right?
Yeah. So, you read this maybe 5 times, 6 times?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so.
No, but not with bottoms, in my face. My question is, the 2 pieces of the talk, one where you mentioned I believe, West Indian speaker in the film saying, in contrast to my face, which can have moods, the bum is always itself. And then you ended by saying something else, which is that the bum is a star.
Yeah.
So can we parse those 2 different dimensions of the body? Sorry for go super performance theory here, right? There's something about the kind of character versus the face, you know? And there's something about the dialogue that she's having with someone like Warhol, right? For whom the face, even though it's like a made up face, right? It's often a masked face. It's the face of celebrity. It's the face of the drag queen. She's onto something here, and you're onto something here, in kind of identifying each bum being a kind of star without having the face, without having a kind of facial feature.
Yeah. And she's not in love with faces, right? So like smile, for instance, or yeah. I mean, maybe a better way to put it is not that the bum is a star, but like bumness is a star. Like and I think that butts like jelly lend themselves to a kind of lend themselves easily to hapticity in film and video, which is to say, like a real sense that the distance between visuality and materiality, or looking and touching, are collapsing in the quality of the movement, and the movement of the form and the form of the movement on the screen. So, and I also like, and I think, she plays with starness in like what I'd love to do now that you've made me write the piece that fell out of the book, which actually makes, but like, is to really take seriously the dialogue in the background and like the conversation in the background, where there's a lot of like, and it's like, the Agamben phrase, the bourgeoisie goes to the cinema to see the gestures it has lost. It's so like groovy, like the dialogue is like, what's the scene? And like, it's the London scene, and people are like, is this really art and stuff. But like, there's lots of people going like, is this gonna be good for my career? Like, am I going to get a credit? And she's like, yeah, you're definitely going to get a credit. And he's like, but it's my bum, not my face. And so, so part of what she's doing too, and then, in that longer quote that I've sort of extracted from, she starts to talk about like how art has become, art has become this sort of increasingly hierarchical and professionalized scene, but like film is becoming increasingly aristocratic in its practices. And she doesn't want that, right? She wants, again, this sort of like democratizing practice, and she's like, run with this film idea, do it in New York, do it in Ohio, with my blessing, bums. So yeah, I mean, there's that. I think the other thing happening in here is like the question of like, what is cinema in this moment, and how is it running away from its like avant-garde potential? But yeah. And I think we could poke at a whole bunch of ironies in there, right? Like, I think if I had been in the groovy London scene of the 60s, and I totally wish we could have a 60s do-over, don't you? Like, you could see all those names. And I totally stared at the names to see if I could, and like, there are people whose names might be recognized. And certainly around the film, like, celebrity gathered, and then it made her a celebrity. So yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. But I do think, like, the bumness of bums, which leans itself to like, like Lennon later said, got one, everyone's got one, right? And that's about bums. It is like depersonalized and de-individuate, lends itself to that, while maybe not being entirely able to escape. Like, I would totally be watching, like, she definitely has the best butt. Like, you're all thinking that, right? Like, I would wax that, but yeah. Yeah. Oh, I totally froze on the cojones.
And it froze on a kind of anomalous kind of running bum.
Yeah.
You mentioned the word depersonification just now, and I was, because that was actually the word that was in my head. That.
Yeah.
And this goes to some work of mine that comes from way back, but like thinking about the kinds of intimacy that we enjoy that are not expressive. Which is one way in which like erotic connection or sexual connection is, where you're not necessarily narrating the self and bearing the soul, but being with each other's bodies.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, this is that to a certain degree, right?
Yeah.
And so I was thinking about that, but then also I hadn't thought about this in relationship to rape, because like it's the thing they're chasing through much of it is actually the shot of her face. right? They're behind, it's not just following her, right? They're constantly going up with the camera and trying to get her, her face. And then the struggle at the end of the film is actually all about her face and her hiding her face. And anyway, I just found that really cool. And then also like just it made me think too about, like street harassment and like whistling, and it's like, it's the tits and the ass.
Yeah.
Right. And so I was just like, this also feels like a kind of direct, like a kind of a taking of that kind of cruising asses, like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It made me see it in a different way.
Yeah.
And then, and I think it's important that we go through jelly to get there. And for some reason that felt like a very Ono move to me, which is like, think of jelly.
Yeah.
Right. And then kind of like make a hole in the jelly, like that's kind of something I can't quite put my finger on it in the same way that's hard to put a finger on actually something you would call like Ono style or signature or practice.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Well, this, I think I first gave this, what is it, 2025 already? Fuck. But I first gave this version of the gelatinous paper at NYU Performance Studies, I think, almost a decade ago. And it marked a real change. So I was a dancer and I was a writer before I became a scholar. And so this dancer once said to me, how do you ever refer to being a dancer in past tense, right? And so one of the things that I think I was really starting to think about, and I try to do in the book, and I'm reaching for it in the book, and I don't think I really get there, but I'm trying to get there through Audre Lorde, is to think with atmosphere and to think with the diffusion of atmosphere. And what Lorde is doing with the erotic is to contract and expand erotics so that it's a kind of infusion and diffusion and an atmospheric envelopment, such that the everyday is full of sensory possibilities in such a way as to undermine our alienation from ourselves under capital. And very specifically in those lists, and in the book I talk about it much more, in those lists, she lists together this sort of flat ontology of objects and people, but then also work, and also housework, and then also creativity, and also sex. And there's this sort of flat ontology there, which is why I really think we have to go back to the uses of the erotic as a response to the alienation of labor, and as a rethinking through of alienation. And so when I began to do this piece, and I was really working with the Dirty Surface, the fact that the Dirty Surface piece is a screensaver. Do we even have screensavers anymore? I think we've forgotten about them, right? But the screensaver, sex turns on when you forget about work. That's what's so brilliant about his project, right? It turns on in the background. You go away and you do your thing and you come back, and the whole time this erotica has been playing in the background, and it's porn. And maybe it infuses the room. Maybe it changes what you're in. And I think there's something very specifically about the hapticity of the gelatinous that allows us to get to an alternate sensory order that we could then think through to a different kind of, to an unalienated relation to the sensory order, but also the other part of it, and that's where, and thank you for saying it's Ono-esque, because I will take that to my grave. That for me, this piece and thinking with David's piece was actually me coming back to the dancerness of myself and really wanting to produce atmosphere creatively in the rooms where I was performing my writing, such that I was living my work in a different way, which is why it was so sweet to go back to reading about Ono's work, because like I said, as a child of the 60s, I was in so many of those kinds of rooms with performance and installations. I had this memory come back to me yesterday of going to an all broccoli installation at A Space in Toronto in 1972, and I was just out of diapers. I was 3. It's one of my first art memories, and I really do see my work with the gelatinous as trying to reintegrate maybe not performance, but aesthetic production with my thinking, and that artist part of myself and that dancer part of myself that I thought I left behind, into being in the room and having ideas with people and trying to imagine something better. And David's piece was really what helped me get there. Yeah. Bridget.
Thanks, Kyla. Really, really fantastic. And a couple of points. One is I was struck by the fact that there is actually lots of documentation about the consent that she established with every single participant.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about how unusual that is, especially during this time period. And so I was curious if you could say a little bit more about that in the archives, which is also so interesting in relation to other aspects of her work, including, of course, rape. And then the second thing is I was thinking about this film in relation to her work prior, and I really think that this film was a major turning point in her career. For one thing, she really reached a wide public at this point because of the publicity that the film generated. And so while she was working with kind of a coterie, cast in the filming of it, a lot of people learned about the film because of the publicity it generated, and also because of the censorship and the protests over the censorship as well.
Yeah.
And so it very much became a film about the public space. And so the fact that your analysis helps us to think in new ways about the manner of its imagining a more expansive mode of collectivity, working through the gelatinous. It helps me to think about the kind of very public imaginary aspect of this work in a new way, in the context of it's also having become a public demonstration.
Yeah.
And also remembering that Ono actually she gained widespread public recognition before her relationship with John Lennon became public. I mean, because she was already known as the maker of bottoms.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I guess the first part of it, really I'm new to the archive, and so I'm hearing this for the first time, and I'm not surprised. It seemed to me that consent, the negotiation of consent is explicitly embedded, and this might be naive, right, but it's felt to me, sitting for 80 minutes, which I did, with the piece that consent was embedded into the formal structure of the film through sound. That's right, it's through the dialogue, it's through the kind of space that it seems to me, without having touched that archive, she allows people, or people are allowed to explore their ambivalence, explore their dislike, state their dislike, decide not to do it, decide to do it, talk about what it felt like, so that seems to me embedded. It totally reminds me of the lesbian processing room at the Killjoy Castle, right? Where we all sat and talked about our feelings afterwards. But yeah, so that seemed to me to be already embedded, and it just can't be any surprise in the conversation, the restaging of Cut Piece, and then in Jen's talk about rape yesterday, that she's always thinking with consent and staging at the edge of consent. But this seems to me it's foregrounded, the consent is foregrounded. And also, so the Dirty Surface, is someone who's taken a lot of public heat. He received a lot of funding, Canadian Arts Council funding, and to teach porn, and then of course the Sun and all the conservative rags got onto this, and that's why he's very, very careful, because he's actually just scared to go to jail, and that's why that sort of, but to me that then kind of links to the question of the idea of democracy as rule with consent, and of course deeply problematized on 100 different levels. I forget the second part of your question. Yeah. But thank you for that, and yeah, if I pursue it, I'll go to that archive. Yeah, do you want to, Sarah, and then do you want to come back to Bridget? Yeah.
Thanks, Kyla. I wanted to ask about.
You guys, Sarah is a fellow jelly scholar. So you didn't know we existed.
There aren't a lot of us.
Now you do. Now you do. Yeah.
To that, I wanted to ask about this kind of series of associational moves you've taken away from jelly as a substance that we eat towards something that we touch.
Yeah.
and to kind of like ask about what the difference means to you that we can't metabolize these images or even these like bums in a way that we can metabolize jelly, knowing that there are like many like jelly molds that are made to mimic human bodies in erotic and funny ways. I think of like the Copeland steeple mold that looks like a penis, or like, I mean, they wiggle, they're funny. People have thought they're funny since the 18th century, at least.
Yeah.
So, but this is different in a way that makes the interaction maybe more tender than it doesn't need to be this tender, but it is a real kind of like free play that doesn't result in any kind of extraction. And could you talk about that?
So I'm not sure I totally get your question, so let me say it back to you and you can tell me if I've got it wrong. So I think are you talking about the sort of associative structure of the paper, which, or?
Yeah, just so we went from like jelly
Yeah.
to margarine to bums. Even in margarine, we're talking about touching it, not about eating it. And then we get to bums, which is, you can't eat anything.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
there's
you
no
could,
eating.
but,
There's no eating. I never noticed that. Yeah, there's no eating. Yeah, I mean, I guess because I was largely, so, okay, so, all right, actually now I'm remembering. Okay, so in the larger chapter, so I am someone who works in the 19th century and who is in conversation with the history of science. So in the larger chapter, actually, the way that I go through is, it may interest you or to know or not, but you're going to leave here knowing it, that in 1819, Napoleon convened a 39-year gelatin commission. In which he had, which is really kind of some of the early interest, one of the places that's the beginning of modern industrial science. And what it is that in the 19th century, rivers are clogged with animal guts and animal bones and animal waste. And one of the things that Napoleon is trying to do, right, with the rise of kind of industrial cattle and growing kind of theories of infection and concerns about cholera, is clean up the rivers and clean up the trash problem. And he does it by encouraging scientists to find a way to repurpose animal waste as food for the poor. And so so this is part of my argument about gelatinousness and kind of like abjection and poor bodies, that this commission on gelatin, and part of this story of the commission on gelatin is actually what, like, when they call like the craft to science move, is like actually like they're taking housewives and women's cooking knowledge and turning it into science. So there's a kind of culinary history to the and then I also talk about I also talk about Melville and some like puddings and gelatins in Melville's work, where there's like actually a lot of revulsion around eating gelatin and eating pudding. But I'm really interested in how in Melville people are like taking in gelatin as they're trying to get closer and closer to poor, like the interlocutor is a poet and he's like trying to get closer to these poor people. And so he eats their pudding and he's like gagging. And I'm really interested because Melville really wants to undo the distance of visuality through the proximity of touch, and disgust for him is not a rejection. Disgust for him is actually an opening of the self to otherness in a kind of Levinasian sense of like encountering the other. So there's actually eating in the chapter. This is like, but the visual. But you're right. I think that the visual register is a different one. I have 5 minutes. Phew. But no. But I really thought it'd be like 20 minutes and we'd all be like shuffling out like that. So yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer that except to say that I'm interested in thinking through the political history of the senses. And I'm really interested in upending aesthetics as a form of, I'm interested in upending the deployment of aesthetics in the service of state violence, but also the deployment of aesthetics as a disciplinary history in the project of violence, which is largely upheld by the separation of politics from aesthetics, both at the state level and at the disciplinary level in our universities and in our knowledge forums. And the thing that art, which is always smarter than any of us does, is it gets at that by upending sensory orders. Often, I'm trying to explore by leading us to new forms of sensory encounter that don't seem to be accounted for by how we narrate our senses. So one of them that when I think of gelatinousness is, for instance, mouthfeel. Right, that mouthfeel. Now there's this whole science of mouthfeel. In fact, there's like a journal of mouthfeel and texture and food texture and stuff. Super, also governed by rheology, by the way, but and a little bit biochemistry. But you know that that in fact, like when we eat pudding, what's happening is a kind of sensory encounter with gelatinousness that in my account in the chapter is as uncanny as the encounter with it in the world. Like, it's weird how it's moving over there on the table when nobody's talking to it. But it's also weird because it won't go down. And those two things, I think, are related. And that sort of sensory disruption of like, why is that thing responding in the corner to the conversation I'm having here? Is it listening to me? Is it a person? And why is this thing pushing back against me in my mouth? That those are kind of interesting moments of like aesthetic counter-aesthetics that seem politically productive, or that I'm at least hoping, or I'm trying to experiment with thinking of them as politically productive. Bridget, did you want to do your follow-up?
I would just say that one thing, so in my archival research, I did come across Yoko Ono's invitation to John Cage to participate in Bottom's piece.
Wow.
Which was, and I'll be happy to email you scans of that material. But yeah, it was really remarkable. And she took an advertisement from a magazine. I can't remember exactly what the tagline was, but it was something about pleasing your man. And with this kind of, magazine husband, and glossy advertisement. And she drew a diagram of what she expected his bum to look like on screen. And, and he wrote back, he said he had absolutely no interest at all. And so, anyway, it's just kind of an interesting, and so I also see it in terms of the talk that I gave yesterday. This is part of her breaking away with that scene, as in terms of how I see it.
I feel like, so this is like totally projection, but I feel like so many, I'm assuming women artists, but it's just like women intellectuals, like we go through these developmental phases of being like entirely in love with the aesthetics of like phallic performance, and then realizing it's like always gonna let you down. And then moving into the next phase where you're like, go fuck yourself. Right? And it just like your recounting of Cage and like and Ono's like continuing to try to break into that and walking totally, like that's what I was thinking yesterday. I was like, right, that's the phase in her creative life where she was like, if I can be closer to the men who are doing it right, I will have the goodies that they get. And then you finally go like, fuck them. They're never gonna give it to me. They can go fuck themselves. You wanna show your bum, John Cage? Go fuck yourself. Yeah. Anyways, totally just riffing on that. Anyways, thank you all very much for coming.